I'm Sarah Anderson with the Institute for Policy Studies, and I get to moderate this first panel. Like many of you, I'm carrying some bruises from that battle over the big, ugly bill that Scott Wallace just mentioned, and I am so ready to pivot from defense to talking about what we're for. And I can imagine that many of you slogged through the DC heat this morning because you're also feeling that way. So am I right? Who here is ready to talk about what we're for? Yes, and to kick us off, we have an all-star panel of economic justice visionaries. We have Saket Soni from Resilience Force. We have Erica Smiley from Jobs with Justice. And we have Faiz Shakir from More Perfect Union. And I'm going to start out with Faiz, because More Perfect Union has been going around the country talking to working class Americans and sharing their stories. And you recently won an Emmy for a documentary based in Ellicott County, Kentucky, where people voted blue for 144 years straight. And in the documentary, it was interesting that people even talked about how their parents and their grandparents were big fans of the Roosevelt administration. And so I looked it up, the year that Henry Wallace ran as FDR's running mate in 1940. Their ticket carried 76% of Ellicott County, Kentucky, this poor rural county. By 2024, Donald Trump got 80%. He did even better than them. And so I'm so curious to hear you talk about what you and your teams at More Perfect Union have learned by listening to working class Americans across this country.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Sarah, for allowing me to pump More Perfect Union. I don't know how many of you have seen More Perfect Union's website or any of our content. Raise your hand if not. Okay. Well, for those of you who haven't, welcome you go onto the YouTube page, youtube.com/moreperfectunion. Simple situation, right? Right now we live in a society that increasingly is harder and harder in any media outlet or any political venue to hear the voices of working class people. It's become greater and greater challenges. I've personally have witnessed it, sitting alongside Bernie Sanders for now 10 years, as he has gone and run both 2 presidential campaigns and done public advocacy for a long period of time, and you can sense it still feels too much of an iconoclast. What makes this politics so different? And it's the basic notion that as a public servant, your job is to know and understand what is the condition of the American people and to advocate for their improvement. And as we've grown into greater wealth and income and disparities, the pull, you can feel it, all of us in this room feel the pull, the gravitational pull of, hey, for a comfortable life, just tell the stories of the wealthy, just be well connected. We're watching this play out in Zoran, once again. New York City will once again show us a replay of, if you are an honest and sincere advocate for the condition of 60, 70% of people living paycheck to paycheck, trying to improve their lives, you are going to be told by elites, by lobbyists, by PR firms, can't cost too much, can't do it. And our job collectively is to address it, I think, by 2 major things, at least those are 2 in my mind. One is to be of scale. When you're at scale, when you're reaching tens of millions of people, knowing that they are on our side. I've seen it with my own eyes, running with Bernie Sanders around the Fight Oligarchy rallies, we had 23 stops, 13 states. We're in Boise, we're in Salt Lake City, Shreveport, Louisiana, Fort Worth, Texas. Red areas where tens of thousands of people are out there. I know it deep down, they're with us, but they don't see people of integrity willing to fight and understand their lives. So here comes, what is a small endeavor on my part, try to build More Perfect Union, tell stories of them when they see themselves reflected as they should be, as heroes in their own struggle. That is what they are. You work paycheck to paycheck, you're trying to do essential work to improve people's lives, you are a hero. You are a nurse, you are a Starbucks barista, you are a garbage collector, I don't care. You are the best in America. And we are seeing this right now, National Public's parks workers, and all kinds of people under assault who are the best of America in their creed, in the integrity, the decency they have to improve the lives of others beyond themselves. They don't see that reflected in politics. So one of our jobs is to just continually be voices and advocates for the condition in telling the stories, knowing that we're up against constantly an assault of, you can't do it, you're naive, you're a naif, you're a fool, don't advocate for those who are struggling. And the challenge related to scale is then depth, and that's Sarah's work here and the value of Institute for Policy Studies and so many that we're trying to build the ecosystem around, is that, you know, as mentioned before, the lack of faith now, as I've traveled around the country, seeing it from people saying, I don't think you have a policy design that you can get anything done. I like you, I trust you, I think you want to do something. I don't think you can do it. And our job here is to show them, I think it is possible. We can create policy designs that will improve your life. That is what Medicare was. That is what Social Security was. But we have to live in a new age. AI is coming, data centers. By the way, you live this, data centers, speedy approvals, must move them through. Pennsylvania, yes. Get it up and running, permitting process fast. Could you imagine the same thing for affordable housing? Could we live in that world? It is possible. We saw it with COVID, right? We stand up clinics all over the country, put shots in people's arms. It is possible. It takes a fight. And it takes a policy design. And so I'm thankful, Sarah, for the work that you've done. But in my mind, we're building this depth and scale. It is the time to regroup. I was reminded of when Steve Bannon talked about Trump in his 4 years out of power. He said he was like a lion in winter. He was gathering power to come back and be a lion in the presidency. Such as us. We are lions in winters now, and hopefully we'll come back here in 2-4 years with the power and the policy design and the scale to conquer.
I'm going to turn now to one of the great fighters in our movement, Erica Smiley from Jobs with Justice. And I want to start out by getting your reaction to some quotes from Henry Wallace. The dude was just so prescient. I can't resist. So the setting is 1943. As vice president, Henry Wallace went to Detroit in the aftermath of racial violence that had left 34 people dead. And he spoke to a multiracial working class crowd of 20,000 people. And this is one of the things he said. He said, those who fan the fires of racial clashes for the purpose of making political capital are taking the first step towards fascism. And you want to know what he said was the second step towards fascism? Destroying labor unions. So I want to see what you think about that, and if Henry Wallace was right that destroying fascism is a step towards, destroying labor unions is a step towards fascism, what should we be doing to support building worker power, and what opportunities are you seeing?
Well, yes, it is very prescient, and I want to respond to this question, and then I'm going to agitate us a little bit around our framing of things, because it's prescient to us. I don't know that it's always prescient to some of the people that Faiz is talking about, and that's something we have to actually grapple with. And so the first thing I'll say is there's a reason that unions have been called schools of democracy. It's one of the few places where people have to come together across ideology, faith, geographic communities, to potentially align around a shared self-interest against the boss, right? Or just a shared self-interest with their coworkers. That in order to win, they have to cross racial lines. They have to cross lots of different boundaries that they wouldn't normally cross, and they have to have hard fights, because we know democracy is messy, and they have to actually get in there. And so the idea of destroying labor unions is critical, because one of the things that we like to talk about at Jobs with Justice is that the fight for democracy, if we're thinking about ourselves almost in a war for democracy and against fascism, some of the most peak battlefields are happening on the shop floor and in our economic lives. You know, Renee Berry from Chattanooga, Tennessee, is one of the leaders of the Volkswagen campaign. She said, you know, they need us to make the cars whoever's in the White House. Regardless, we might have lost the Citadel, but they still need us to make the cars. And so when we're in a society, you know, that maybe Wallace above everyone else could have foreseen, but maybe Wagner didn't when he wrote the National Labor Relations Act. They could not have seen Amazon basically governing at global scale. You know, I know we're Institute for Policy Studies, but, you know, policy in this moment, if we're just thinking of policy in traditional government capacity, it's like me going to the the Confederate States of America during the Civil War trying to pass like the Voting Rights Act. You know, it's just like we have to think of our terrain a little differently. And I think in that context, this idea that the fight for democracy is happening in our economic lives is really prescient. The second thing that I want to say is that we don't necessarily get to shape the fight. So my parents, who still live in North Carolina, in Greensboro, they reached out to me independently in February, and they were like, you can't go to Target. Now, mind you, I think I might have been at Target at the time, right? Like, I was getting my good and gather snacks. Like, I'm sorry, no shame to my game. Strawberry popsicles are my shit. Anyway, I was like, why can't we go to Target? They're like, you can't go to Target. It's a Target fast. They're giving, the DEI, all this kind of stuff. And I said, oh, God, okay. It's like, I wouldn't have picked this fight, but that's cool. I'm not going to cross the picket line, especially if my parents are organizing it. So I stopped going to Target. 8 weeks in, post-Easter, post-Lenten fast, Lenten season for those who celebrate Christmas and Easter, the company had consistently had foot traffic down for 8 weeks in a row, then 12 weeks in a row, and on and on. The company's even meeting with boycotters. What do you need us to do to go away, right? It's not necessarily the fight I would have chosen, but you damn sure believe it's the fight we have when this could be one of the most powerful consumer boycotts of this modern era for a national, multinational corporation. We typically tell people not to do it, but it's actually working. Now, the leaders know that DEI isn't necessarily like the fight of our lifetime, but they know that it's what's activating people to do something, to take action, and to actually organize based on their economic power and their economic relations. Which leads to like the third point, and I'm sorry I'm a little all over the place, but I wanted to both give respect to Henry Wallace's quote while also trying to grapple with the moment we're in now, which is that we stink about talking about stuff. First of all, when democracy is working, it's actually quite dull, right? I mean, it's like boring. It's decision making, and that's good. That's a good thing. But like, that's not the excitement of the fight. I was actually talking to people at University of Southern California. They're like, we want to insert, more labor stuff into the scripts, and what do we look like? Pickets, and we get Scabby the rat. And I was like, yeah, you can do all that too. I was like, but really, if it works, you just, I'm gonna have a baby. I was like, oh, okay, we'll just go down to your union steward and fill out your form. They're like, that's not exciting for the script. I was like, I'm sorry. I mean, that's actually what happens when it works. That it's not that exciting. But it is exciting to be able to make it to your kid's basketball game. It is exciting to be able to afford eggs. It is exciting to be able to be on that bowling team or whatever, right? Or to not have to work multiple jobs. That is very, very exciting. And so when we're talking about this, and my colleague Sarita Gupta always reminds me that, on the one hand, we like to refer to ourselves at Jobs for Justice not simply as a workers' rights organization, but as a democracy organization, as an organization that leans into the economic path towards democracy, right? When we think of Reconstruction, we think of the Reconstruction Amendments. The first one was a labor amendment to abolish forced labor and slavery. And then the second one started to deal with citizenship. The third one, suffrage. So we think of ourselves as a democracy organization in the economic and labor lane. But Sarita always reminds me, she's like, yes, we are for democracy. We're also for joy. We're also for everyday people being able to live dignified lives. We're also we like to say only the best for the working class. Sometimes we need nice things. We need nice things too. And that's actually critical in engaging people, whether it's in Ellicott County, in Guilford County, where I'm from, in Jasper County, where my father's people come from, in engaging everyday people to let them know that, yes, we want to build a democracy you can see yourselves in. We want to build a democracy that is full of joy and dignity and respect, where you get to actually make decisions, not just in a political context, but in everyday life. And the fact that so many have abandoned that piece, even people who are supposed to be aligned with us. And Adam Dean, I know you guys know, who's a professor. He's fantastic. Wrote a book called Cracking Up to Build. I don't know what it's called. Forgive me. His name's Adam Dean. He's great. But he was writing a book about free trade. He didn't realize that he was writing a book that explained the rise of authoritarianism around the world. He basically was making the point that Henry Wallace made when he said that in order to spread free enterprise, free trade, neoliberalism, the first things they had to do was to, you go to India, you've got to bust up the labor union. You go to Colombia, you got to bust up the labor unions. You got to get rid of them first. But this is for the better good. It's for civilization. It's for democracy. We told everyday people they had to do this in the name of democracy. We gaslit them by telling them neoliberalism, capitalism was democracy. And now they think democracy screwed them. So now they're mad at democracy. Of course they're going to throw a Molotov cocktail at democracy. But we have to remind them that was not democracy that screwed them. That was something very different. And that in order to win, we have to actually center the institutions that themselves are an everyday practice of democracy.
Love that. Thank you. I'm going to turn. I'm going to turn to Saket Soni, who I met in 2008 when he marched along with 500 immigrant workers to DC to protest the deplorable conditions they were suffering as they were working to rebuild the Gulf Coast in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. And I know meeting those brave people, we gave them an award, so we got to meet many of them. It really had a big impact on IPS, and I know it changed your life. You can read all about it in Saket's book, The Great Escape. I know people love it when you show their book. A gripping read. And so you kind of had your start focused on protecting immigrant workers and lifting up their standards, and your vision and your work has expanded a lot to something you call Resilience Force, and I wonder if you could explain that and the opportunities there.
Sure. The group of workers that Sarah is talking about were brought from India as immigrants to rebuild the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina. I stumbled upon an extraordinary crime. They were locked into deplorable conditions in labor camps. They escaped from those labor camps, and we marched them up to Washington, D.C. That takes about 3 weeks, in case you want to try it on foot. But I want to tell one story that I hope will showcase my skills as an organizer. Which was that we marched all the way to Washington, D.C., but when we got to D.C., I realized that I actually didn't have directions to the White House. I had no idea where we were going. So everything else was on schedule except the march through Washington, D.C., where we asked passersby, where is this place? They would say, it's over there. Directions to the White House in politics and geographically are somewhat controversial. So it took a while to get there, but when we got there, right in front of the White House were John Kavanagh, Erica Smiley, Sarita Gupta, M.B. Maxwell, and so many others from this community, which is just all to lead up to an incredible shout out to these institutions, but ultimately institutions are people. And people who stick with people who stick with a set of values. And I just want to give a huge shout out to IPS for always being there for us, always being a beacon for us. So thank you all. I didn't know it then, but that group of workers was really the first among many, many waves of migrant workers that would rebuild cities after hurricanes, floods, and fires. After Hurricane Katrina, there were 1 million homes to be rebuilt or repaired in Louisiana, 1 million more in Mississippi. Just to put that in context, there were about 12 to 13,000 homes to be repaired in LA after the wildfires. We're talking about 2 million homes to be repaired. And all of that rebuilding and repairing was done by immigrant workers, itinerant workers, or migrant workers from other states. And after Hurricane Katrina, which was supposed to have been, this was now 20 years ago, Hurricane Katrina was supposed to have been a 1,000-year flood. There wasn't supposed to have been an event like that for the next 1,000 years. Since Hurricane Katrina, there have been over $300 billion disasters. disasters that have caused $1 billion of damage or more. And every time there has been a flood, fire, or hurricane, again, immigrant workers have gathered, driven there, and become the white blood cells of the recovery effort. So for 20 years, I've been embedded, sometimes 6 months of a year, with these immigrant workers. They sleep in their cars, they wake up on the floors of Home Depot parking lots, they wash themselves with bottled water, they get on roofs and they repair. And over the last 20 years, this workforce has accrued incredible skill. If you don't think these are skilled workers, try getting up on your roof the next time it rains and fixing it. But they've acquired more than just skill. They've become incredibly skilled, and they've acquired a deep sense of vocation, a kind of purpose, a sense of calling. And here's what I see, and this leads to some ideas for our progressive community. What I see is every time there's a fire, flood, or hurricane, immigrant workers arrive. When they arrive in Louisiana, in Florida, in other places, in Kentucky, you have immigrant workers rebuilding the homes of people who just the week before the hurricane thought of immigrants as the enemy. And suddenly these people are expressing gratitude to immigrants. And we're using that opening, that little sliver, the doorway to light, that an expression of gratitude actually is. And we're bursting it wide open. We're putting these immigrants in relationship with the community that they're rebuilding. We're creating bonds. We're transforming those bonds, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes we play matchmaker. We're transforming those bonds into long-standing relationships, long friendships, and into the basis of a new civic fabric, into building social cohesion. And I think that's an important piece of our strategy right now as a progressive community. We as activists, as advocates, each of us, we do an incredible job taking responsibility for winning on our issue, winning on racial justice, on labor rights, on unionization, on the expansion of the safety net. So we have these social movements. Sometimes social movements are strong. Sometimes we're lions in winter, as Faiz said. But we have another layer of responsibility as well. Each of our movements must take responsibility for building a much broader social cohesion, for building a cohesive whole that looks like and calls itself America. And that's the work really that I'm proudest of our workers doing. I'm so proud of our thousands of workers who get on roofs. But equally hard is the task of repairing the social fabric of this nation. And so when they get off those roofs and through interpreters, they have conversations that help them build bonds with the people who are being helped by them, this opens up something profound. As progressives, we all need to build efforts that organize people, no matter what their politics, that organize people into a new sense of the public good, right? I spend 6 months out of the year, sometimes more, 8, 9 months out of the year in disaster zones. And whether I'm in Texas or Kentucky or Louisiana, every time I talk to people after a hurricane or flood has hit, what do they want? They want government money. They want public dollars to help them. They want public housing. They want public dollars to go right into building them a new hospital. Not only that, they want to defend disaster SNAP and disaster unemployment, the parts of the social safety net that are guaranteed after disasters. And again, here's an extraordinary opening. So, we've been developing this work over the last, I would say, about 10 years or so. I'm very, very grateful to Representative Pramila Jayapal for really being our champion on this. Again, IPS was the space in which we really figured out a new legislative agenda around resilience. That agenda is its own wonderful, amazing lion in winter, but it'll be back. But I just want to say one last thing, which is, we often talk about connecting movements. The labor movement, the racial justice movement, the climate movement. It's very important to hear and connect movements. But equally important is to really allow these connections to emerge from the ground. I spent a long time as a labor organizer. I'm a labor organizer who spends most of his time in disaster zones. And there was a time when I was a complete stranger to the climate movement. One more shout out, by the way, is Ellen is actually one of the people who really taught me what the climate movement was. So thank you, Ellen. But see, here's the thing. That person sitting at that kitchen table after we've repaired their roof and we're having lunch with them and they're thanking us and the whole church has come out because we met him through a church and then we're going to build the next parishioner's house. Those people aren't experiencing this as solidarity with the immigrant rights movement. They're not experiencing it as building a working class agenda. They're experiencing it as we rebuilt their house. That's it. And it's okay for that to be it. And actually, that's much better. Because I'm not passing out business cards at a funeral, right? I'm building a long-standing, deep friendship with that person. There are people's homes we've rebuilt who have been in my life for 20 years, right? And ultimately, those are the kinds of real relationships we're going to need across division if we're going to win. So that's our work, and thank you so much again for having us here.
Yeah. It's incredible to think about disaster zones as a place to look for hope of overcoming our divisions. I forgot to mention that we hope to have a few minutes for questions, and we're going to have people who want to ask a question write them on a card. And so I think people are passing them out, but maybe if you want to raise your hand, if you want to write down a question, we'll gather them up. First, I'm sorry, but I'm going to go back to this awful budget debate for a minute because I had something I wanted to ask Faiz about. More Perfect Union did a great video in California's 22nd district, I think, a place where 2/3 of the people are on Medicaid, and yet their representative to Congress voted for a bill that will cut Medicaid more deeply than at any point in our history. And one thing that's been just so frustrating about this debate is knowing that it would have been so different if some of the marquee progressive ideas had already been in place. Universal public health care being one of them, one of the most obvious one, perhaps. And because countries that have adopted it, it quickly becomes completely non-controversial. I mean, you never hear right-wing Canadian politicians talking about rolling back public health care in Canada. It's just considered part of the infrastructure, like roads or something, And Faiz, you managed Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Medicare for All was a central part of his platform. Can you see a path towards that in this country? Are we going to join the rest of industrialized nations anytime in our lifetimes?
God willing. I mean, I was just reminded, you were talking, Sarah, there's many people here who know British history a hell of a lot better than I do, but I'm reminded of Nye Bevan. They come into power in the wake of World War II, and it says, the most powerful thing, Nye Bevan, of course, and health secretary, and he says, health minister says, I am going to develop the National Health Service by July 4th, whatever year it was. And for the next 5 or 6 months, travel the country, talking to every physician, getting them on board, talking to people, building a movement, set a date, said this will happen. Guess what happened? And I look at some of the design and the kind of gumption, we'll call it that for now, of the Trump and his team, right, is to break norms with outcomes in mind. They are thinking out every day, outcomes. It is chaos of a sort, but results of an orientation that is disruptive. And I think too much my own criticism sometimes of our wonderful center left is we tend to move in a technocratic manner, think with our heads, and conceive of all of the risks, the concerns of the institutions, the norms, the precedent of human history that has taught us various lessons, more averse to the disruptive. So if you were to take these two teams, right, we'll call A versus B, one team owning disruption, other team maintaining status quo. And here we still are struggling with this question. So here, in the wake of Medicaid cuts, what do we assume a center left is going to go and tell the American people about healthcare? And I ask you that because I suspect the answer will be, we will restore the Medicaid cuts. What is that? Right, just listen to us talk. We will repeal the effort that they underwent, right? It's a fine, rational answer, but if you're out there struggling and your life wasn't all that great before Medicaid cuts in the healthcare system, it was a struggle, they come and do this thing, and you're gonna go back to them and say, I'm gonna return you to what it was 3 years ago. Not very compelling. And we are still missing this kind of sense of a disruption and a boldness in healthcare. I promise you. I know for many of us who've lived with, the Bernie, Medicare for All, there's a sense of Obamacare, all of these fights for long periods of time. I get the sense of an exhaustion. I sense on the center left often about this issue because we've struggled and toiled for this for a long period of time, and yet we are going to have single payer in this country, and the single payer will be United Healthcare. That is the track that we are on. You would look at, anyone looking at the design of the current healthcare infrastructure systems are seeing the collapse of Molina Healthcare, Centene, UHG. We're left with, really, Cigna is the only health insurer because they only provide employer-sponsored insurance in this country so they can survive, but everything is collapsing. And where are actual people? So the toil that we are in is that for the top 20, 30%, things are gonna be fine. And then the question for us in our policy design to urge the center left to think about constructive solutions after they've burned things to the ground. What are the solutions for rebuilding rural hospitals in America? And in my mind, like the way I think about this is ownership design. There is a world in which, and I welcome Sarah trying to figure this out together, is like we are gonna go to people and challenge them, I hope, on ownership design. That is economic democracy. Should your rural hospital only exist if a corporation owns it and can profit from it? Is that the only ownership design that we can conceive of? And I hope not. You have Zoran talking about municipally owned grocery stores. For anyone who's lived on a military base, done it for a short period of time, some of my best friends, were in the military. You know what a BX is? Go to the BX, base exchange. That was federally provided, right? Funded to provide. The municipally owned grocery store, federally owned grocery stores, right there. I think we have to challenge ownership design in these ways. It doesn't all have to be, I can give allowance. Does that Medicare for All could be an awesome, wonderful solution, but for those who are right now in solutions-oriented mindsets, employee-owned hospital, co-ops, municipally funded. If you look around, some of the best public hospitals we have in New York City and elsewhere, public hospitals. There's been decline in this regard of our ambition. And if I were to ask you, right, say, besides Zoran right now, who is thinking about that ownership design as constructive solutions and challenging us? I suspect society is ready and willing to welcome these kinds of questions as long as we have wrestled with, how are you gonna get it done? Give me a path. I'm thirsty in the desert here. And if these guys come along and throw a data center at me for a job of only 100 people can benefit from, gives me maybe $18 an hour, I will take it. 2 drops of water in the desert. And I think we're coming to them with whole cantinas and buckets if we can convince them and persuade them of policy design. And I would urge all of us to start thinking about ownership models that not only in healthcare, but in a whole variety of realms that would inspire a lot of people beyond just status quo, disruption for good.
It's really interesting. I've got a budget-related question for Smiley too. Sorry to bring us back to that, but I was also thinking during this whole ugly debate how it would have been so different if we had a federal minimum wage that was a living wage. And we wouldn't have so many people having to rely on SNAP, so many working families having to rely on SNAP if people actually made enough money to cover their costs. So at Jobs with Justice, I know you're doing support for organizing work. I know some of your member groups have been engaged in battles over local minimum wage increases. You've also talked, I think, about using taxes to try to pressure companies into paying living wages. Where do you see any opportunities there for dealing with this crazy situation where the minimum wage is a poverty wage?
Well, I appreciate the framing. I guess I'll react in a couple of different ways. Firstly, one of the solutions that you're mentioning, we're right now we're playing around with the idea of calling it a Tesla tax, but it's kind of like our original McWalmart fee or bad business fee, where we try to find corporations to create funds for workers to control. It's not just to go into the budget, but to actually have worker controlled decision making. Because again, we're trying to create containers for people to actually practice democracy and not just have to count on the people you elect to do it for you, bless their hearts. Which leads me again to the containers of struggle in this particular moment. I mean, there's plenty of money. This is something that I feel like we also stink at when we're talking about it. I couldn't agree more with Faiz. Like, this is not a matter of going backwards. We aren't trying to restore, because as a Southerner, like, I actually had a union president say to me once, right after the first Trump election, if we could just get back to the way things were in like the 50s. And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
Not a really good time. Not a
Not
really good
for
time for my
everybody.
family. But so I'm totally with that. But again, in this context, when we're thinking about sites of struggle, to get a little bit outside the box from what we're trying to do. So not just to talk about what we're going back to, but to also talk about where sites of governance really are. There's so much money. There's so much money, and it's ours. We created it. And when we tell everyday people that in their communities, whether we're talking about their public hospital or their stadium for their football team or whatever it is, like, there is a resonance there that's actually really important. And so the idea of whether it's through a Tesla tax, of creating a fund that workers were able to control, or finding other ways to extract that money from corporations to put it back where it needs to be. I mean, this is the other strength of unions, the institutionals of unions that we have today in the United States, is that for better or for worse, it is an actual model for extracting capital back into the hands of everyday working people, both through living wages, through healthcare, through other benefits and needs that everyday people have. And so the idea that we need to actually create more of those structures to make that a popular idea, that some things that people want, they can then decide if it goes into wages or into healthcare or childcare or housing or whatever it is. They can make that decision, because that's democracy. I'm not going to tell them what to put it for. And I'll end with this. We are working with a set of workers in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area. We joke around, it's the biggest organization of Amazon workers you've never heard about. And that's by design. We'll let you know when we're ready to let you know about it. But we went in there thinking, we're about to go hard on wages. We're going to go hard on this question of being able to live in the city on poverty wages. And they were like, well, actually, that's great. We want more money if that's possible. But really, we're stressed out because of the injury rates. We're dying. This is a job where you come in, and it's almost like the military. You're signing up to be disabled at some point. And most urgently, one of the things that we ended up having to take on was this question of pregnancy accommodation. Like, a lot of people who could carry pregnancies were experiencing miscarriages because the company wouldn't accommodate them. Now, it's the law to accommodate pregnant workers. It's federal law. It's the law in New York in the Warehouse Worker Protection Act. If a company like Amazon is not going to obey the law, is that where the fight is? Or do we need to actually figure out governing and setting standards in the place where those companies are already governing, whether it's a labor market like that or a global supply chain? And so I do think whether we're talking about wages, injury rates, and meeting the needs of everyday people, to actually see the containers of governance a little bit differently, because they currently have the Citadel. They currently have Congress. We have to accept that. That doesn't mean that we give it up in the future, but it does mean that we have to think about the landscape of our struggle very differently so that we never end up in this situation again.
That's great. Are there questions? Oh. One is, what are examples of workers' access to power with a diminished National Labor Relations Board? Eric, I think you've written quite a bit about non-traditional.
I mean, this is a great question, because it's like, if we want to assume that, like, is that you? All right, holla back. It's like, did unions exist before the Labor Relations Act? Did it exist before the New Deal? Were workers organizing and doing stuff before then? Heck yeah, they were. So our power is not based in the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act is based on power workers organize in order to organize and collectively bargain, to negotiate, to have democracy. And that's always been the case. We still have that power. You can't take that power away because they didn't give it to us. It was ours in the first place. How what? With power. Like you can legislate, just like I said around Amazon, we can legislate that you should recognize workers all you want, and they can say no. The National Labor Relations Board, when it was working under Abruzzo, said you need to recognize the ALU at JFK8, and they said no. But I guarantee you, when you start getting into that company's pocketbook, because just like Renee said, they still need us to build the things. When you start shutting down the sorting sites and the primary centers where that company can't actually move the goods to make the money they want to make, that's power. Then they have to come to the table. That's how you get them to recognize you.
Smiley, can I just add on that point? One example of what Smiley's talking about here. Outside of the realm of labor unions, one of the most inspiring things right now that I'm watching is tenant unions. Tenant unions are not filing NLRB, right?
Yeah.
You are mobilized, to Smiley's point, you're mobilizing the people who have the rental units right here.
You have to pay the rent.
We're a democracy, right? And guess what? In this power dynamic, we have more power to change the conditions. And quite frankly, they are succeeding. A lot of these tenant unions are changing conditions to improve their lot.
That's right. They're organizing along the same economic lines. In this case, rents instead of wages. When you withhold the thing that makes the operation work, whether it's a housing facility or company or a corporation, right? Like, that's power. That's how you win recognition, and that's how you win a seat at the table. And not just a seat at the table, an equal seat at the table, which I want to specify, right? Because that's how we negotiate standards for the better. And so when people ask me, for example, how would Amazon workers even negotiate a union contract? Like, how would you do that, even under the National Labor Relations Act? As if it was all working perfectly, like, would it be like some national agreement? Would it be a global agreement? And I say, I don't know. Like, somebody's got to Francis Perkins their way into figuring out what the institutional setup will look like. But what we're going to do is ensure that we have the power to have an equal seat at the table. We're going to make it very uncomfortable for you not to recognize us. And this is where our movement has got. I'm sorry, I'm very passionate about this. I'm like in Saket's face. Saket's like one of my mentors, by the way. Right, but this is where our movements have gotten lazy. We just want to legislate our way out of things. When my ancestors were facing the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, you didn't legislate your way out of that. You had to fight your way out of that. You had to fight. Now, there's no way that they could have known that the Emancipation Proclamation was coming 15 years later. But they had to fight with the imagination that things could be dramatically different. And they did not try to just fight that fight in Congress. They had to fight it certainly in every state legislatures, and they had to fight it in every job site, every agricultural plantation, everywhere where they were, in order to contest for decision-making power to be able to have self-determination over their lives.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, that was a question about the NLRA.
She wrote a book about this too. You might
did.
want to plug, right? It was Sarita.
Yeah, the
Gupta.
future we need. Yeah, with
Yes.
Sarita Gupta. I mean, yeah, we love the NLRA, and maybe we need something better.
Great. We just have, I think, 1 minute left. So maybe this is one for Faiz, and then I'll toss one to Saket as well. How do we convince our Congress people to support ownership, an ownership-designed economy? And then maybe for Saket, if you want to end up with, like, where would you like us to be in 10 years, briefly, in 30 seconds?
First, I want laboratories. Democracy works best when there are, we're experimenting. We don't get stuck in status quo-ism, that there are, we're fighting in some sense for economic democracy. And we understand this in the political realm, that everybody should have one vote and that super PACs shouldn't buy elections. We understand that in the concept of no kings, right? That's the same kind of concept that we want in an economy in which there are fighting, powers. If you're a small business, can I compete against Meta and Google? If I'm a worker, can I organize my labor union, have civic democracy, right? The workplace democracy. These are the kinds of things we're fighting for. So in that context, the ownership design can come from all of those things. Like right now, there are no honest small business coalitions in America, right? We have fake, astroturfed versions, but it's very hard to find industry-specific things. Worker forms of a lot of different models. I am a fan of unions, but there's also, as we know from Europe and there are a lot of different models to talk about how people can gather together to combine in power building. Right now, we are kind of in a stasis of people feeling we got authoritarian rule in the country in a sense of stagnation of democratic forms of ownership. And I'm hoping that at least from the ground level, there is a desire, but we have to have people pointing to constructive solutions. So if you find some, here thus falls into More Perfect Union's lap, I would love to know, is anybody in any place doing anything of constructive design? Because I will tell that in a story. And that is what I feel is strongly important about More Perfect Unions. You're gonna change the consciousness, reach scale, say, hey, that community over there just canceled medical debt. I think I can do it over here. All you're trying to do is unpack, somewhere, somehow, people taking matter into their own hands. So please write to me if you ever see any of these, faz@perfectunion.us anytime. Please.
Thanks. As a sense of their reach, I did get an email last week from a relative who's very conservative, but had seen me on a More Perfect Union video, and it was one of the few things we've been able to connect on. Saket, take it away. It's the one that Liz did about CEO pay and stock buybacks. Yeah.
There was a IPS worker back there holding up a sign, and it said, "You guys are so great, we canceled the next panel. Just stay right where you are." So we may have more time than we think.
In other words, she's doing her job, and we are actively going beyond.
So I'll offer, I guess, these glimpses into the future that I'm lucky enough to have when I go around the country looking at how people prepare for disaster. And it's actually quite closely aligned with something I didn't know, which was the ecological politics of Henry Wallace that you described, which is wonderful, which is extremely inspiring. So, we know now that disasters are going to be with us. Now, many of you live in the DMV area, I imagine. You have intense rains all the time. Those are not newsworthy events. So, we've gotten to the point where many people I talk to, they plan for disaster, they just hope their disasters are in the news. That's where we've gotten, right? Because if it's in the news, you might get some money to fix your house. Disasters are going to be here. The rains, the hurricanes, the storms, the floods, they're a new normal in more ways than one, and we need to prepare. Meanwhile, the federal government is pulling back on one of the most fundamental jobs of the federal government, which is emergency management, and which is funding the repair after disasters, right? We are going to be entering a few years where FEMA and disaster aid are essentially a scattershot political patronage system. That's what we're going to see, which is going to cause untold grief and untold pain, too much even to count, right? Grief after grief. Somebody told me in Louisiana, I'm fed up with grief. I'm fed up with grief, right? So that's where we are, right? And at the same time, in California, in Sonoma, after 5 years of fires, political officials wanted to move to preparation, not repairing. And we took minimum wage, out-of-work farm workers, retrained them as resilience workers, codified with partners, and ecologists and scientists, codified indigenous practices into new workforce training, trained this workforce, and through an apprenticeship program, put people at work. People who were earning minimum wage now earn $35 an hour doing that work. $35 an hour. We're bringing that model to LA because of the fires. We're in conversations in many of the Western states and in similar conversations around the country. And what I think this can all lead to is that despite the terrible facts of life in the federal government, in the states, we can really shift to a kind of preparation that is a vehicle for building a new workforce, new building blocks of social cohesion, and the new muscle that is really a precedent condition for what Faiz is talking about. For people to have a vision of collective ownership, they have to be used to the idea of having a collective, being together. That's what I think is the brilliance of Smiley and Sarita's book, because overall it's not just about policy, it's about unions are laboratories for democracy because it's how thousands and thousands of people learn to be one body together, right? And we have to do that as a society. And I think we can do that through an ecological vision of preparing.
And Saket, before you wrap, can you also just, because there's an alternative that's not great to what you're saying, right? Because certainly the Trump administration would help clean up so long as they get to buy it afterwards.
Yeah.
Right? Like so just to say what we're up against.
Well, the alternative is that every climate disaster is advance for a caravan of developers that flip properties, price people out, and redevelop so that only the wealthy are able to live in enclaves and everyone else commutes as a worker. And that's really what has happened city after city. You enter a death spiral where you don't have enough population to pay for services, the tax base evaporates, and you shrink your cities. And that's the alternative. But I don't want to end with that vision. No. I want to end with a vision. I want to end with a vision of that dinner I was at where a family sat at a kitchen table and spoke to a group of Salvadoran workers, not about immigration, labor, or anything like that, but about how it was to be home, wherever they called home. And I think we can find our way home and scale that idea of home.
Much more to come.